Welcome back to the Dale Wiley Show. Today we're talking with Aretha Sills, part of the first family of improvisational theater. Aretha's grandmother, Viola Spolin, started the movement, and then her son, Paul Sills, founded Second City and popularized the idea of improvisation. She's also a huge fan of country music, and we've got great stories and thoughts today, including a little about Bob Dylan and Wanda Jackson and Lemmy.
I'm here today with my friend Aretha Sills. Aretha comes from a really interesting family with a great heritage in the theater, and now she's kind of taken that and made it her own, and she is doing some things with the Spolin. What's the official name, Aretha, of the theater group that you work with?
Well, I don't really work with a specific theater group. I give workshops in the theater games of Viola Spolin.
Okay. And Viola Spolin is your grandmother.
Yes.
And I know a lot of people will know that name, but if they don't, tell me what is Viola Spolin's legacy?
Okay. Viola Spolin is the author of a book called Improvisation for the Theater, and she is considered the mother of the American improvisational theater movement.
Okay. And then your father, Paul Sills, kind of took that in the same vein, but in a little bit different direction. Tell me a little bit about Paul.
Paul was a director, and he had studied with his mother from childhood. He played her theater games when she was developing them at Hull House in Chicago or wherever she was teaching them. And he grew up to be a director, and he founded a bunch of theaters in Chicago that were some of the first improvisational theaters in America. The first theater he founded, co-founded with a fellow University of Chicago graduate, David Shepard, was called Playwrights, and it wasn't an improvisational theater, but it had a bunch of amazing actors who were there at the time. At the university, and there was no drama department there, but there were people like Mike Nichols and Elaine May and Ed Asner and Severn Darden and all sorts of wonderful actors who were there at that time. And then he went from there. They went on to a bunch of the same people went on to form a theater called Compass. And David Shepard was the producer, and Paul was the founding director of Compass. And they used Viola's games to work up improvisations from scenarios that they had written. And then in the later in the evening, to round out the evening, they would do improvisations more as we know them today, sort of with suggestions from the audience, that kind of thing. And that also had Mike Nichols, Elaine May, an amazing group of people, and then from there he was the founding director of Second City, which he co-founded with a producer and a friend, and Bernie Solins was the producer, and Howard Ock, and the Second City has gone on to become a theater that's pretty much recognized as the ground zero for improvisational comedy in the United States.
Right. And we shouldn't forget Eugenie Ross Lemmy in this.
Yeah, she was in Second City, I believe.
Right.
Dale is a super fan. We'll talk more about that. We'll have to explain that one later. But I think she was also in Story Theater.
Oh, wow.
But I would have to, which is another a form of theater that Paul Sills created and took to Broadway, and which is the adaptations of folk tales and literature using the sort of transformational space found in Viola's theater games.
Well, and whatever she does, Eugenie Ross Lemmy will not return my calls. Maybe now that I have a larger platform.
Maybe she would be on your show, Dale.
Maybe so. Maybe we need to arrange that. She sure wasn't willing to talk with a young zine writer back in the 90s, that's
right,
for sure.
Right.
Well, and now I remember that Viola lived, she was alive when we were friends. She died in the 90s. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was like 94.
It was when we were friends because I remember that Dan Castellaneta came to the funeral and you got to have a recording of Hi Aretha in the Homer voice.
Right. I don't even think I recorded that, just in my memory.
Oh no. Well, dang.
He spoke to me. It was, But that's all right. I still know Dan.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. And
he's a wonderful improviser.
Oh, good. Well, did he study at Second City, or how did he come to know your grandmother's methods?
Yeah, he studied with Paul in the 80s in Chicago, and at a certain point he did study with Viola, and he was a member of the Second City Company.
Okay.
And then he moved out to L.A. and did the Tracy Ullman Show, and then from there, The Simpsons. But
right.
Probably not doing justice to his full bio. But he's a great improviser. I was just lucky enough to be in a workshop with him and his wonderful wife, Deb LaCosta, and a bunch of other wonderful improvisers, where it was sort of a workshop for people who are writers and improvisers. And it was fun to see them play.
So when how was what Viola did different from what your dad did?
Well, Viola was a teacher. She came out of the progressive education movement that was really around Hull House in Chicago at the turn of the last century, where all these immigrants were coming in, and Jane Addams had created Hull House as part of the settlement house movement to really help the immigrants integrate into the American culture through education and the arts. And so there were a ton of classes there, and they were all really geared toward helping the community, the people in the community, become participants in the democracy. It was kind of amazing. So Viola found her way there because after high school, her sister took her to go study with a woman named Neva Boyd, who is teaching group work at Hull House, which is, I guess, what we would call social work now. And Neva Boyd was like the Alan Lomax of traditional children's games. She would go around collecting from Europe and America all these children's games that were, already sort of being forgotten, but, they obviously, kids were allowed to play more in the street, wherever in those days. But she would publish these chapbooks of traditional games, and she was a theorist of the uses of play in education. And she went on to have a school to train social workers at Northwestern University and other universities. She was really widely just well regarded in that field as for training social workers. So that's how Viola started out. And Viola had always been very interested in the theater. Her father was a Chicago policeman who actually would be sent on opera detail, I guess, to guard the opera stars or whatever. And he would take Viola and she would watch. And they were Russian Jews. Both her parents were immigrants. And the family had a tradition of putting on theatricals. And they were very dramatic. And they would improvise shows, comedic and dramatic shows. And they would actually write, 3-act plays about their own history, about, coming over from Russia and the revolution and all these, So Viola grew up in that a way of life that may be being lost a little bit in our media age, where people had to entertain themselves.
Right.
They would get together and sing around the piano. That's the kind of people they were. And Viola was a fun-loving kind of girl. She was a basketball player, so she was already primed for this understanding of it. She loved the theater and this understanding that Neva Boyd was teaching her, that children learn best through play. And Neva Boyd also believed that morality is taught through play because we all agree to the rules of a game. There's no disputing it. I mean, occasionally there is, especially when you play Monopoly, but we agree to the rules of a game, any game, because it's more fun that way, because that keeps the play happening, right?
Right.
So, in a way, children are learning a kind of morality, a kind of social contract, how to behave with other people. So, in the 30s, in the late 30s, Viola was wanted to teach drama and to direct. And she worked for the WPA. They had a dramatics project in Chicago. And so she was working with immigrant kids and or just like, city kids and adults who were very often immigrants. So there was often a language barrier with her students.
Sure.
And anytime she had a problem directing, she would create a game instead of just telling the people what to do. Okay, you go over there, you speak loud, or that kind of thing. She really understood how people learn because of her work with Neva Boyd. And so she would create a game for any theatrical problem she had.
Wow.
And so she developed this huge system. And also, the other exciting thing about when you learn through play is that there is a kind of purity and spontaneity involved in that. And then so the acting that developed was astonishing to people and lively, and just the way people are in real life when they're highly entertaining, instead of or they're in the moment, they're in the present time and they're truly being themselves on stage, as opposed to a more traditional, like in those days there was stentorian kind of acting and speech delivery, so it was a bit radical what she was doing, and having and then she would have performances, and some of the very first improvised performances were by these kids in Chicago in the 30s. The very first suggestions taken from the audience, were by this kind of neighborhood kids. There's some great clippings about the shows she would do and how surprising they were to the critics who would go see them.
Well, and if we kind of correlate that to what was happening in Hollywood, for example, I mean, that's when Orson Welles kind of comes in and does the same thing, in Hollywood of creating a more kind of not improvisational, but a more kind of spoken, a different way of acting. Would that be the way to say that?
Yeah, her timing was good. It was needed, right? I mean, it wasn't that kind of stiff acting wasn't going to work on film for too long, especially once they got sound. But Paul, I guess your original question was what was the difference between what Viola did and what Paul did?
Right.
Viola was also a director. I mean, she had a children's theater in L.A. here where she directed, and her games came out of directing and an understanding of what was needed, what a director needed from an actor on stage. But Viola was really an educator. That's the tradition she came out of, was the progressive education movement, and that was really what she was about. Whereas Paul was really a director, and he's considered the popularizer of her work because he used it in creating theaters as a way to train his actors and as a basis of his theaters. And so as someone once said, he brought her work to the world. Okay.
Do you think, or I mean, I could go even further if it's there, but I mean, does the method acting movement, does any of that borrow from what Viola was doing, or
no? In fact, they're very different. But Viola did study with the group theater in Chicago. I mean, in New York in the 30s. She went there and she studied with Lou Adler and whoever else was there. And she knew Stanislavski, and she understood it. But the difference is, in improvisational theater, it's not scripted work. It's
right.
It's a group art form where everyone has to create something entirely new together. And so improvisational theater requires everybody to be in the present time. And so there are distinctions in the work where, like, obviously sense memory wouldn't work in that case because it takes a player into a subjective space, a sort of a memory that only they share, and it takes them out of the present moment or whatever's happening between the players on stage at that time. So there are differences that between those two schools of acting, and that's one of the major ones. So I don't think they have their own sense of improvisations, but that's where those schools split.
Who were some of the improvisational actors that Viola and Paul really enjoyed?
That they really enjoyed?
Yeah.
Well, Paul had like sort of an unofficial company of people that he worked with. That that a lot of them were people who'd come through Second City with him, and so in my, there were actors he would return to again and again, and so one of them just passed away. Richard Libertine was an amazing improviser. He's really pretty well known as a character actor. You might have to see him to know who he is, but he was in The In-Laws, and he is one. Richard Shaw, one of the greatest.
Del Close was one in his group too, wasn't he?
Del Close was under his direction in Second City quite a while there, and Del also studied with Viola, and because Viola led the workshops at Second City, she was the director of workshops. Yeah. And Paul's company, Avery Schreiber was a member of his company, Hamid Hamilton Camp, Louis Arquette, Severin Darden is considered, Mike Nichols considered him the greatest. Severin Darden was always one of the people he and Viola both loved watching Severin improvise. And he had he was a very University of Chicago type humor where he had this professor who was an expert on everything. And so he would ask the audience, you'd ask the audience, what should he speak about? And there's a couple great 60s records of his. And I forget, Valerie Harper worked with Paul and Viola a lot. Paul Sand is an amazing improviser and was always from childhood. He studied with Viola in childhood, and then he went on to be in Second City, and then in Paul Sills Story Theater, and he always worked with Paul always wanted to work with Paul Sand. Alan Arkin was another person who studied with Viola as a child here in Hollywood, and then went on to Second City. Paul invited both Alan Arkin and Paul Sand to be in Second City early on because he'd seen them as kids, I think. Anyway, it goes on and on. I'm forgetting people, but he had Melinda Dillon, the actress, and Mina Kolb, who is a great comedic force and still with us, was in the first company of Second City as well.
Oh, wow.
There's many more, but there were a group of people who really were his players.
Now, when we get further down to the ones that took it to Hollywood and made it even more popular, what did Paul think about what they were doing? I mean, of course, Belushi and Harold Ramis and those kind of people. What did Paul think of that version of Second City? Yeah,
Paul had moved on by then. I know he thought Belushi was funny. I don't know if he would have seen, I can't remember if he saw any Harold Ramis movies. Paul wasn't that interested in pop culture. He was kind of, he would sit around and read Martin Buber and Thoreau, Yeats, we'd be watching TV, and he'd come in and be like, oh yeah, I know that guy. But I don't remember. I know he saw Stephen Colbert and early on. Stephen Colbert, who was a Second City guy, you know.
Uh-huh.
And he was sort of in love with what he was doing there, and and I know he admired Belushi. But I can't honestly say that he ever sat through a whole episode of Saturday Night Live, you know.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Once he was done with sketch comedy, he was really more about the theater. Like he and he moved into the theater after Second City. He left Second City to form a community theater called Game Theater in Chicago. That was a space where like peace, you know, Women for Peace would meet, and the local church groups who were, you know, gathering people to protest the war, and all these people would come together and meet there, and they'd play Neva Boyd traditional games and Viola Spolin's games, and and it was there that he started Story Theater, and it was just before the convention in Chicago. So they were all sort of being radicalized by the war, and he was no exception, and he really, because of Viola's, you know, sense of working in the community, that's where he believed the theater belonged, that it needed to emerge out of the community. And so, you know, he developed Story Theater there, and it was a big hit in LA in the early, and then it moved to New York to Broadway in 1970, and he worked in Story Theater pretty much the rest of his life in that art form.
And when you were born in Chicago, but then your family actually moved to Woodstock, didn't they? Is that how that happened?
Oh, we did live they lived in Woodstock not very long, I don't think.
Okay. So, but
they moved
before.
a lot. Like, yeah, I was born in 1969 in Chicago, and we lived there a couple of years. They bought a farm up in northern Wisconsin in Door County, where we still have that farm, and we teach workshops in the summer in the work of in the theater games of Viola Spolin and Paul Sewell's Story Theater. But yeah, there was a short period in Woodstock because they would live in New York sometimes. But I don't know if they lived there very long.
Okay, well maybe I guess I just had interpreted all of the stuff you were talking about, Albert Grossman and that sort of thing. So I guess I thought you guys were living up that way.
They were friends with Albert Grossman. Albert Grossman didn't he own the Gate of Horn in Chicago?
I think so.
Yeah, and so Paul managed the Gate of Horn, and that's how he learned to run a nightclub, the Second City. That's how he learned by managing the Gate of Horn. And he saw Coltrane and Dylan, and, you know, he recalls it as a very amazing time. And he loved Bob Dylan. My father adored Bob Dylan. And there was, and so Howard Alk, one of my father's dearest friends, and the first hipster in the world, a very brilliant, amazing man, was the co-founder of Second City. And he was a filmmaker as well, and made some really cool music documentaries and all sorts of other interesting movies, like The Murder of Fred Hampton was a movie he made. And he was friends with Bob Dylan. And so Bob Dylan was like, I want to make a movie. And Howard, I think, and Albert Grossman were like, well, you should talk to Paul.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they met in Woodstock. And I think, so my dad was like, well, what kind of movie do you want to make? And he said, well, I don't know. I just think it should be muddy, and it should be set in a trailer park. I think that's what Bob Dylan wanted. And then he said, I'm going to show you a movie I really love, so come back tonight. So they came back, and he was like, no, the kids can't watch this movie. And it turns out it was it was Freaks. He was screening them, Todd Browning's Freaks.
Oh, wow.
this was in Woodstock, and he set up a projector on the side of like an outbuilding. So they sent the kids back, and my mom, she went into a local cafe, and she found some girls, and she's like, "Would you babysit for us? Bob Dylan wants to watch a movie." And so these girls were like, "Oh, okay. Well, if Bob Dylan, if you're going to hang out with Bob Dylan, okay." So, early 70s parenting. You have to wonder. Luckily, everyone was okay. But anyway, they went back and watched Freaks, and she said, my mom told me that Bob Dylan at one point the projector was like inside of a little shack or something, and he had to go break into it or something. He'd locked himself out and had to go break in, and anyway. But eventually they watched Freaks, and then nothing really came of that collaboration. Those two weren't quite.
That was in the early 70s?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so this would have been, was that kind of what turned into Ronaldo and Clara, do you think? Or, was
maybe.
A different idea?
Maybe. Howard worked with him after that for a long time. But I don't think Paul and Bob Dylan were really on the same artistic wavelength there. But Freaks certainly is a fantastic movie.
Well, that's kind of a segue from, the things that you're doing right now in the theater. And Bob Dylan, I know, is as big a touchstone as it gets for you as far as musically, although much of, how we met originally was I saw and fell in love with your zine Maybelle and started writing for it. And so kind of tell me, because, for a zine that really didn't reach that many hands, that's still well regarded. And so tell me what kind of led to that.
At least by us. Well,
there are other people too.
I don't know. I don't think we ever topped 200 circulation, like all in, all told.
Well, I do have to tell you that, the fact that one of my interviews was quoted in that 500 greatest songs in country music that David Cantwell and Bill Friskus Warren put out clearly indicates that we reached more people than we thought we were.
I know, and it's amazing. I didn't quite realize that. Which interview? The Tom Brumley one?
The Tom Brumley one, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I have to check that out. I don't remember that. And then later I was doing some research. We did a Townes Van Zandt interview for Maybelle, and that was quoted in some Townes Van Zandt books, and I didn't realize this till just a few years ago. When I was researching for like a piece on the 15th anniversary of his death that I wrote, and I couldn't believe that these people had gotten their hands on on the copy of Maybelle, like where they had found it. It was amazing.
Well, I think on mine they were talking about when I talked to Tom about the Garden Party show and how he just felt like Rick's interpretation of the booing was so far off and how much the people really loved him. But, Rick was concentrated on something else and, it led to a great hit. But, so tell us, for people that haven't read, tell us about Maybelle.
Oh, okay. Well, Maybelle was founded by my friends Tim Clifford and Bill Stavrou and myself. We all went to Bard College. That's how we knew each other. And we just were kind of country music obsessed. I don't know even how it happened. We just were, all three of us. Bill lived in Brooklyn at the time, I think, and Tim and I were in San Francisco. I'm looking at our first issue. It was spring of 1994.
Right.
And I think I had gotten laid off from a job at the Potholder outlet in San Francisco. We used to yes, I worked at a Potholder outlet, and I was getting some unemployment, and so we decided just to spend our time like writing about music instead of just always chatting about it with each other and making ourselves laugh. And and we named it after Mother Maybelle Carter,
right.
goddess of the guitar.
Right.
And there weren't a million magazines named after people like there are now, but that was it. It had an irreverent spirit, and yet we were very reverent of the music.
And a very detailed knowledge of the music as well.
Sometimes I read back things I wrote, and I'm like, oh boy, yeah, I didn't, there was no internet. There was stuff I just, I was young. I think, well, that was wrong, but okay, I accept that. But yeah, we cared. We cared deeply about the music, and we were kind of limited. We really it was kind of about 70s country music,
Right.
Even though it was named Maybelle, but we loved more than 70s music. But there was a certain fascination with, the great stars of our childhood, kind of Willie Nelson and Dolly Parton and Loretta Lynn and
Well, and
Merle.
so I talked with Tim Clifford a little bit about this, but clearly, as was it T.S. Eliot that talked about his world being divided between Dante and Shakespeare? I mean, your country music world is clearly divided between Dolly Parton and Merle Haggard. And even though I think everybody has a much better understanding of kind of the artistry of those people and how differently, they're not looked on as rubes and hicks anymore, I still think there are a lot of people that maybe don't understand how breathtaking they are. And so tell me a little bit about your favorites.
Oh, boy. You mean about Dolly and Merle?
Yeah. Tell me if somebody doesn't look at them as anything other than, they appeared as guest stars on Hee Haw or something.
Right.
Tell them how wrong they are and how badly they should.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, they both suffer a bit from some misconceptions. I think Dolly, because she's so just sparkly. And so, she wrote that song, Dumb Blonde, just because I'm blonde, don't think I'm dumb. But I think we understand Dolly now more because she's so outspoken about herself. She has those great lines like, just about that it takes a lot of money to look this cheap and that kind of, she has a very self-aware sense of humor about her own image that people obviously love. Obviously, she's sort of a gay icon and, there is no shame in admitting you really love Dolly Parton anymore. Pretty much everybody thinks it's cool. In some way, shape, or form, it's understood. Merle can be, but I still don't know how many people actually listen to her music, given all that, and know what a remarkable, astonishing kind of songwriter she is, and how she's this living link between, English ballads that traveled the ocean and the oral tradition, that goes back centuries, and popular music, the fact that, the songs like Jolene and what's the
My
one?
Bridge Mountain Home and, Down from Dover.
Down from Dover.
Maybe they weren't musically, directly connected, but lyrically they clearly were.
Yeah, and even somewhat musically. She had a different sort of rhythm going on in her songs and a different kind, like the guitar lead, in Coat of Many Colors, that kind of thing. The way it just, the way that there's just so many verses, there's a lot of words. All that goes directly back to those old story songs. And so I think Dolly is just a treasure in that way. And sometimes I wish Dolly would return some more to that. But she did do those really wonderful bluegrass albums. And
she decided about 10 years ago, she figured out that she could kind of come back to some of that stuff that she had spent her whole career getting away from. And she's done a good job of that. Like I would like to see her do more, but she's definitely moved further in that direction than many people, did.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. I mean, I don't really love those albums, but but I know people who do, and they are really wonderful.
Well, I think that I mean, if you don't have all of the Porter and Dollar records from the early 70s, and you don't, kind of obsess about it like we do, I mean, I'm sure they're fine, but they're just not, what's that one, Satan's River, and, all those songs that are just so shockingly good that she wrote, and,
You sent me that one recently.
I did. That was my contribution. I mean, that's still...
one among many, Dale. One among many.
Well, so tell me about Merle. Tell the people about Merle and what...
Merle, I don't even know how to begin to talk about... I think Merle is like the heir to Stephen Foster,
Uh-huh.
I'm not exaggerating. Like
Sure.
I am prone to hyperbole, yes, but I think he's seriously an amazing songwriter. And sometimes I think, but except that some of the best songs, the most Merle-like songs that I treasure, aren't even written by him. So he's also this great interpreter. He really recognizes other people's talents, like that Blaze Foley song, "If I Could Only Fly."
Yeah, I Could Only Fly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, some of his other and some of his most songs that you think, God, that's just so Merle, are not even written by him. But he The Way I Am, that's one. His songs are, they call him the poet of the working man. But there's something about the detail in his songs that I think any writer would be jealous of, and the sort of honesty. He has a certain way with language that is just kind of, there's certain people who have that, like Billy Joe Shaver or who else, are great songwriters. And I'm going to get all inarticulate here because what is it? But Merle he can tell a story very often from a point of view that gets you very sort of deeply invested in the story. When you think of his songs like Carolyn or Kern River, or he's often the If We Make It Through December.
Right, that was one I was thinking of when you were saying that.
Yeah, he's often there's not a lot of self-pity involved, but someone's left him in a lurch. He's got a problem. Sing Me Back Home,
right.
And whether it's about love or something, with much higher stakes than even that, like death, impending death any second. He just has a way of walking that fine line between pathos and, just human truth that I don't know, it's unparalleled.
Well, and he's one of the few artists that is just a million times better now than he was in the 60s. Now when he gets on stage, I mean, he's just such a force, and age has really worked to his advantage, in my opinion. I mean, his voice isn't as strong, but what he needs to do to songs, what he does, I think he's better at.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's true. He's a wonderful performer. And he sort of does. He sings more like Willie Nelson now because he has to phrase differently for his voice. But but even that's he's a little jazzier.
Yeah.
But he brings so much to every performance. He's who knows where he came from? He came from like this deep immersion into country music, right? Like he was the music that he loved, and he listened to who's the guy? Anyway, I once got to meet the author Gerald Haslam, who grew up with Merle in Bakersfield. He wrote a great book about California country called Working Man Blues. And he went to grammar school with Merle, and of course I was like, okay, I have to talk to you. I met him at a writers' conference, and he said that Merle was always the star. Like, even before he was really into music, that's just the person that he was very sort of well formed and strong. And they all looked to Merle for guidance. And of course,
and a lot of times that was not the best place to look.
Probably not the best idea. He was a little delinquent.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing is, I don't think that, I mean, maybe Johnny Cash, but the two of those guys, well, and Willie Nelson too, I guess, they've been so devoted to their musical roots and, constantly taking things that would not have been the smart commercial move instead to, teach someone about Emmett Miller or to teach them about Bob Wills or Jimmy Rogers or, things that, or the American Indian as Johnny Cash did. I mean, things that wouldn't even be done today. I mean, there's no way that.
See why we love the 70s?
Yeah. I mean,
I got to tell you, I know the way I became interested in Merle was because my brother had given. I have a half brother who's much older, and he wasn't around the family much because he was already grown up, and he was, and he gave my parents a copy of Same Train, Different Time.
Which is Merle's tribute to Jimmy Rogers.
Yes. And so my sister Polly put it on tape for us, and I would listen to it like, we lived in Manhattan. At a certain point, I'd always be listening to it, waiting for the subway and stuff, waiting for a train and everything. I was just obsessed with that album. So Merle got me into Jimmy Rogers, which, one thing leads to another. But a double album?
And to me, even, Johnny Cash's Apache or Bitter Tears, that is just a big middle finger to everything about the establishment. And I mean, there's no way that would be made today. I don't care how big a star they are. That would, I mean, I guess you could make it at home, but no major labels touching that, especially in this day and age. And so,
when you listen, I recently saw there's like a video on YouTube of the Man in Black, like the first time he sang it for on his show, and the lyrics really impressed me. I thought, wow, everyone needs to hear these lyrics right now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, those guys were, just in a different world in terms of how honest they were able to be to their musical roots. And I'm sure they're, Johnny Cash also sang the Ballad of a Teenage Queen and some of those things that were clearly trying to make pop records. So we don't want to kind of estimate that. But what they did was stunning.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
absolutely.
I don't know.
That's why they remain, to this day we still listen to them,
Right. It's because of those things. It's not because of Ballad of a Teenage Queen. It's because of the musical risks they took that took them completely out of, the complete comfort zone of the record company.
Yeah, exactly.
The prison records that Johnny Cash did, all of those things everyone thought they were going to be huge failures, and yet those are about as often today as some of these modern country singers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what we need more of. We need those kind of risks.
Yeah. And a little more good music wouldn't hurt either. A little more good music out of Nashville. Nashville, if you're listening, please stop it and do something else.
They're all listening to us right now, I'm sure.
They clearly are.
Yeah.
For the first time, 10 days after I started, we're hitting more than 500 plays today. So kind of excited about that.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
Good for you.
Yeah, well, so Aretha, if someone wants to hear more about your theater games or how you can participate, tell me what they can do.
Well, visit the website violaspolin.org,
Okay.
We have a page on there for workshops, and you can get information about my workshops in Los Angeles.
Right.
Or our summer intensives in Door County, Wisconsin, which is a very beautiful place in the world. We do week-long intensives, so people travel from all over to study in a barn, which is really nice, in our barn, and stay in little cottages around Door County, which is kind of a famous resort area. And so that information is on there as well. So violaspolin.org.
Okay. And the last, I think this is kind of timely because Lemmy just died, but tell me your Lemmy/Wanda Jackson story.
So I executive produced an A&R'd a Wanda Jackson album for CMH Records, where I used to work. And this was in 2003, well before Jack White. And I think it was after that I think she had put out a live album after that that was recorded in New York. And so she was doing an in-store at Amoeba. And my husband and I went to go see her to say hello because we were very fond of Wanda and her husband Wendell and friendly with them. Lemmy was there in the audience, and we were like, oh, wow, Lemmy's here. I didn't know at that time that he was kind of a rockabilly fan, but it makes sense. Good for him.
Right.
This Wanda was somehow, I think she'd met him backstage, and someone had told her, you should really introduce Lemmy, for the kids. And so Wanda, in her bright, sort of chirpy way, said, well, we have a very special guest in the audience tonight. Please let me introduce Lenny from Motor Hut. And we all smiled and clapped. And I don't know if I can just imagine Lemmy smiling as well. But so it was very cute. It was very Wanda. Wanda once told me, I'm like a baby duck. Every day I wake up, it's a new day.
Well, that's awesome. Well, listen, thank you so much, Aretha, for spending a little time with me, and it's always fun getting to talk to you, and thanks for sharing everything.
You too, Dale. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Aretha Sills. You can go to DaleWileyShow.net and find some links to her website and the Spolin Theater website as well. And you can buy some books, throw some money, and join us for the next edition of the Dale Wiley Show. Copyright 2016.